Welcome the anointed ones. There comes a moment when the mind that once tolerated chaos suddenly becomes allergic to it, and that moment changes everything. Chosen one. That moment happened to you. You didn't raise your voice. You didn't expose anybody. You didn't even retaliate. All you did was finally understand the game, and somehow that was enough to send certain people into emotional cardiac arrest. The exact second their tricks stopped working on you, their entire sense of power started glitching like a cheap generator during rainy season. Suddenly, the same people who prided themselves on being mysterious and hard to read felt painfully transparent, as if your discernment turned into a spiritual X-ray machine. And here's the fact psychologists rarely admit out loud. When you catch a manipulator in the act, even silently, their brain registers it as a threat, not a discovery. They don't feel seen, they feel cornered. That's why some of them started acting, let's say, dramatically unstable. One minute they're calm, the next minute they're sweating like someone who accidentally left their secrets in a group chat. Your awareness didn't just expose their games, it exposed their dependence on those games. Because let's be honest, some of them weren't upset that you caught on. They were upset that you caught on before they finished their performance. Nothing irritates a manipulator more than an audience member who stands up during Act 1 and says, "I know exactly where this is going." You became unpredictable. You became unreadable. You became someone who no longer reacts to pressure, and ironically, that's what applied pressure to them. They weren't prepared for a version of you that refuses to be emotionally puppeteered. They weren't prepared for your inner peace to become non-negotiable. And they definitely weren't prepared for the moment the target of their mind games evolved into someone who can see the script, the motive, the pattern, and the ending all at once. So now they're upset, pressed, uncomfortable, shaking like Wi-Fi in a thunderstorm. All because you did the one thing they never expected. You woke up and their power evaporated. This is the moment everything shifts. This is the moment their confusion begins and your clarity takes the stage. This is the moment they realize the chosen one they underestimated is no longer playing by their rules, because you finally caught the mind games they thought you'd never decode. Number one, you didn't just see their games. You saw the motive behind the games. There's a huge difference between noticing someone's behavior and understanding the intention powering that behavior. Most people only react to what someone does on the surface, but you went deeper, and that's what shook them to their core. You didn't just catch the mind games, you caught the reason they were playing them in the first place. That level of awareness is what flipped everything. People who use manipulation are used to hiding behind confusion. They depend on others being slow to catch on. They rely on assumptions, hesitation, or emotional fog to keep their control intact. But you were paying attention in a way they didn't expect. You weren't just hearing the words, you were picking up on the tone, the pattern, the timing, the shift in their energy. You understood the silent parts of their behavior, the parts they hoped you wouldn't notice. That alone was enough to unravel them. Because once you saw their motive, whether it was insecurity, jealousy, fear of losing you, or the need to feel superior, the game itself became pointless. You can't be manipulated by someone whose intentions you've already decoded. They felt that shift the moment it happened. Their reactions changed, their confidence cracked, their attitude dipped because they realized the control they thought they had over you was built on your lack of awareness. The second they sensed you understood the why behind their actions, everything they did became predictable, and nothing exposes a manipulator faster than losing mystery. They thrive on staying one step ahead, but your discernment put you miles ahead. You saw their strategy before they executed it. You saw the insecurity behind the bravado. You saw the fear behind the attitude. You saw the dependency behind the manipulation. That's what upset them, not the fact that you noticed something, but the fact that you understood everything. Once you see someone's motive, the illusion breaks. And when the illusion breaks, their power collapses. They knew it, and they felt it. And that's exactly why your awareness shook them more than any confrontation ever could. Number 2, your awareness forced them into a version of themselves they were avoiding. There are people who survive by pretending to be better, kinder, smarter, or more stable than they really are. They build a version of themselves specifically for public consumption, polished on the outside, messy on the inside. As long as no one sees behind that performance, they feel safe. But your awareness didn't just notice their behavior. It exposed the identity they were trying to hide. That's what triggered their meltdown. When you caught their mind games, you didn't just interrupt their strategy, you disrupted their disguise. The moment you understood what they were doing, they could no longer operate from the pretend self they'd been using. Your insight pushed them into their real self, the one they've been avoiding for years. And for someone who relies on manipulation, facing their real self feels like suffocating. They had 2 choices once you knew the truth: drop the act or scramble to defend it. Most chose the scramble because dropping the act means accountability, and accountability is something manipulative people treat like it's toxic. They would rather lose you, sabotage the relationship, or shift the blame than admit that their behavior comes from insecurity, fear, or jealousy. Your awareness cornered them emotionally. When you see someone clearly, it strips away the excuse they usually hide behind. It takes away the "you misunderstood me" defense. It takes away the "I didn't mean it like that" storyline. It takes away the wiggle room they use to keep manipulating without looking like the villain. And because you knew the motive behind their actions, they couldn't pretend anymore. Their reactions started getting shaky. Their tone changed. Their confidence dropped. Their attempts to control the situation suddenly felt sloppy. Why? Because they were being forced to operate from their true nature, not the edited version they present to the world. The truth is, they weren't upset because you caught them. They were upset because your awareness exposed who they are when no one is watching. You pulled them into a reality they spend their whole life avoiding. And once someone sees them without filters, their old tactics stop working, and that destroys the false identity they were clinging to. Number 3, you shifted the power dynamic without saying a word, and that terrified them. Most mind games don't rely on skill, they rely on reaction. Manipulators only feel powerful when you're confused, emotional, or trying to defend yourself. As long as you're reacting, they're in control of the situation. But once you caught on to what they were doing, your energy changed. You stopped feeding their manipulation with responses, and that single shift flipped the entire power dynamic in your favor without you ever having to raise your voice or explain anything. Your silence wasn't weakness, it was clarity. And clarity is something manipulative people can't fight. When you start seeing the pattern instead of getting tangled in it, you become someone they don't know how to handle. Their usual tricks don't land the same anymore. The guilt trips fall flat. The emotional pressure doesn't move you. The back and forth arguments they used to pull you into suddenly lose their grip. And that calmness you carry. It scares them more than anger ever could. They weren't prepared for the moment you stopped reacting because your reaction was their source of control. The less you played into their games, the more they unraveled. They started pushing harder, saying more, doing more, trying desperately to get some kind of emotional response out of you. Not because they cared, but because they needed evidence that they still had influence over your mind. But you staying grounded and unbothered forced them to confront something they were never ready to accept. They don't control you anymore. That thought alone feels like a threat to them. It means the power they believed they had wasn't real. It was borrowed. It existed only in your confusion. Once you gained clarity, the illusion shattered. This is why they're upset. They realized you hold the emotional thermostat now. You decide the temperature. You decide the tone. You decide the pace. And someone who loses control over you emotionally feels like they're losing control over their whole world. Your awareness didn't just break their mind games. It took back the authority they were never meant to have in the first place. Number 4, you broke the loop. They needed you to stay stuck in. Manipulators don't rely on intelligence. They rely on predictable patterns. They study how you respond, what makes you emotional, what makes you soften, and what makes you doubt yourself. Then they build a loop around those responses. It always starts the same way. Create confusion, trigger an emotional reaction, make you feel guilty for reacting, then make peace, just enough to reset the cycle. And the moment you calm down, they start again. It's not a mistake or a misunderstanding. It's a routine they depend on like oxygen. But the day you caught on, the loop snapped. You didn't argue the same way. You didn't fall for the guilt tricks. You didn't rush to prove your worth or fix anything. You stopped feeding the cycle that gave them psychological power, and that one shift didn't just irritate them, it destabilized them. They needed you emotional because emotional people are easier to direct. They needed you confused because confusion keeps you from seeing the manipulation clearly. They needed you feeling guilty because guilt makes you compliant. And they needed reconciliation because it resets your trust enough for them to keep controlling you. You breaking that cycle means you removed every lever they were pulling. Once you stepped out of the loop, every tactic they had became useless. They couldn't bait you into reacting. They couldn't twist your emotions back onto you. They couldn't paint themselves as the victim. They couldn't restart the cycle because the part you used to play was no longer available. And manipulators don't adapt well. They panic when their strategy fails. That's why their behavior got louder, messier, or more dramatic. They weren't hurt. They were malfunctioning. You weren't dealing with a person in control. You were facing someone whose entire system of influence had just crashed. Your growth exposed how dependent their power was on your old patterns. Once you stopped participating, the whole structure fell apart. And the moment you refused to walk in circles with them, you reminded them of something they hoped you'd never realize. You always had the power. They just needed you too distracted to see it. Number 5. They never expected you to decode them. Faster than they could reinvent themselves. Manipulators stay confident because they believe they can reinvent themselves faster than you can understand them. They change tones, shift personalities, adjust their stories, and reshape their behavior depending on what they think will work on you in that moment. Their entire strategy is built on staying one step ahead, always evolving their mask before you can catch the pattern behind it. But you moved faster, not by trying harder, but simply by waking up. You didn't fall for the new version they kept presenting. You recognized that every shift in their behavior wasn't growth, it was strategy. And once you started seeing the intention behind each change, their reinventions stopped looking clever and started looking desperate. They were trying to stay unpredictable, but your intuition was operating on a level they couldn't keep up with. Your mind wasn't reacting to who they presented themselves as, it was reading who they actually were beneath the acting. That's when everything flipped. They thought you'd be impressed by their ability to adjust. Instead, you saw their adjustments as confirmation of their inconsistency. They thought changing their tone would reset your perception. Instead, it made their motives clearer. They thought switching between kindness, distance, charm, and coldness would confuse you. Instead, it exposed how little stability they had within themselves. Every disguise they put on made the truth more obvious. Your quick understanding cornered them mentally. Their usual advantage, unpredictability, completely dissolved. They realized you weren't playing the game at the level they expected. You were seeing the entire board while they were still moving pieces blindly. And nothing shakes a manipulative person more than dealing with someone whose insight outruns their performance. It wasn't just that you caught them. It's that you caught them in real time, before they could adjust, before they could spin a new story, before they could create a new mask. That speed terrified them. It removed their illusion of control. It exposed how deeply you outgrew their tactics. And the moment they realized you operate on a higher mental frequency than their manipulation, the entire dynamic collapsed. Because there's no disguise fast enough to hide from someone who can see through the soul, not just the behavior. Number 6. Your mind became too quiet for their noise to penetrate. One of the biggest shifts you made, and the one that rattled them the most, was the silence that started growing inside you. Not the kind of silence that comes from ignoring someone, but the kind that comes from real clarity. When your mind becomes calm, when your thoughts stop racing, when your emotions aren't bouncing around based on someone else's behavior, their tricks lose their grip instantly, and that's exactly what happened. They weren't prepared for a version of you that could hear their chaos without absorbing it. They were used to you reacting, explaining yourself, defending yourself, or trying to restore peace. That emotional involvement gave them influence. But once your mind became quiet, you stopped engaging with the drama. You didn't respond with panic. You didn't take their comments personally. You didn't let their mood swings set the tone of your day. You simply detached. And that detachment wasn't coldness. It was emotional intelligence. You learned how to protect your energy without announcing it. You learned how to see someone's behavior without letting it invade your inner world. You learned that not every provocation deserves a reaction, and not every conflict needs your participation. That quietness inside you became your shield. To a manipulator, that silence feels like punishment. They feed on emotional access. They thrive on being able to trigger something inside you. But once they realized their words no longer shook you, their tone no longer influenced you, and their chaos no longer echoed in your mind, they felt powerless. They tried to get a reaction. They pushed buttons that no longer worked. They attempted to reignite old emotions. But your clarity had already locked the door from the inside. Your peace became a boundary they couldn't cross. Your stillness became a language they couldn't decipher. Your growth created a distance they couldn't bridge. That's why they're upset. Because the louder they became, the quieter you got. And nothing exposes someone's lack of control faster than realizing their noise can't reach the person they used to influence with ease. Your calmness didn't just protect you, it exposed them. Number 7. Your spirit was unmasking truth. They thought they hid physically. There's a different kind of awareness chosen ones carry, one that doesn't rely on proof, arguments, or obvious signs. It's the kind of awareness that comes from your spirit picking up on things long before your mind has the words for it. And that's exactly why they felt exposed around you. They were performing for your eyes, but your spirit was reading the truth underneath the performance. That alone shook them in ways they couldn't explain. They worked hard to hide their motives. They controlled their facial expressions. They adjusted their tone. They packaged their intentions in polite behavior. They made sure their actions looked innocent, humble, or harmless on the surface. They were confident you'd only see what they showed you. But your spirit was operating on another frequency entirely. You were detecting energy, not behavior. Vibes, not excuses. Patterns, not performances. And the most unsettling part for them? You didn't accuse them. You didn't confront them. You didn't expose them out loud. You simply knew. That quiet knowing is what terrified them the most, because spiritual discernment doesn't give them time to manipulate the narrative. You saw their intentions before they had the chance to disguise them. You saw the envy behind the smile, the resentment behind the compliments, the manipulation hidden behind concern, the competition behind the friendliness. Your spirit caught everything their mask tried to cover. And here's where the panic kicked in. They felt exposed before anything was revealed physically. They sensed that the version of themselves they worked so hard to protect was already collapsing in your presence. It's one thing to fool someone's eyes. It's another thing entirely to face someone whose spirit picks up the truth instantly. That's a level of awareness they can't prepare for, control, or talk their way out of. Around you, their mask didn't just slip, it dissolved. Their intentions became harder to hide. Their energy became louder. Their inconsistency became obvious. They knew you were seeing them in ways they didn't want to be seen. That's why they grew distant, defensive, or reactive. Not because you exposed them publicly, but because you exposed them spiritually. And once a chosen one sees the truth at that level, there's no mask strong enough to recover the illusion. Number 8. The version of you they strategized against no longer exists. Every manipulator builds their strategy based on who you were at the time they first gained access to you. They study your insecurities, your emotional triggers, your desire to explain yourself, your hunger to be understood, and your fear of conflict. Then they tailor their mind games to fit that version of you. But what they didn't expect, what they never prepared for, was your evolution. Your growth made their tactics outdated. Their strategies were perfectly crafted for a person who no longer exists. They were responding to your past wounds, not your healed mind. They were targeting your old self-doubt, not your current clarity. They were manipulating the version of you that used to tolerate their behavior, not the version who has outgrown it completely. So when their games stopped working, they didn't understand why. They assumed you were still operating from your old patterns. They assumed you were still emotionally predictable. They assumed you were still carrying the same insecurities they once exploited. But the transformation you went through shifted your internal wiring. You began seeing things differently, reacting differently, choosing differently. And that change made their tactics collapse instantly. Your evolution removed the emotional hooks they used to grab onto. You stopped giving them easy access to your reactions. You stopped needing their approval. You stopped explaining yourself to people who had no intention of understanding you. And that shift created a gap they couldn't cross. They weren't prepared to deal with a stronger, wiser, more self-aware you. They kept trying to pull the same emotional levers, but nothing moved. They kept trying to push your buttons, but the buttons weren't there anymore. They kept trying to manipulate you through fear, guilt, or confusion, but those doors had been permanently closed. That's why they became frustrated, confused, or even angry. They were playing chess with a ghost. They were strategizing against memories, not reality. They were trying to control someone who evolved beyond their reach. Your growth made their power disappear. Your healing made their influence irrelevant. Your transformation made their schemes unworkable. They thought they were dealing with the old you, but the old you died the moment you woke up to your worth. And nothing is more threatening to a manipulator than a person they can no longer predict, control, or emotionally access. Number 9. Your growth snatched the authority. They believed they held over your emotions. Manipulators don't just want influence. They want emotional authority. They want to feel like they can change your mood with a sentence, make you doubt yourself with a look, or shift your decisions with a bit of pressure. When someone like that believes they have emotional access to you, they treat it like ownership. They treat your reactions like buttons they can press whenever they need control. But the moment you grew past those triggers, you took back a level of power they never expected you to reclaim. In the past, they could provoke you easily. They knew exactly what to say to get a reaction out of you. They knew how to guilt-trip you into apologizing or backing down. They knew how to twist your feelings until you were the one fixing a situation they caused. They were comfortable because they believed your emotions were predictable. But your healing changed the entire landscape. You learned to pause instead of explode, to think instead of panic, to detach instead of internalize. And that shift caught them completely off guard. Growth changed your emotional rhythm, and manipulators can't control what they can't predict. Once you stopped reacting to their chaos, they lost their grip. They tried harder, harsher words, bigger accusations, more dramatic behavior, but nothing landed the way it used to. Your silence didn't mean fear, it meant mastery. Your calm wasn't submission, it was self-respect. You were no longer emotionally available for manipulation, and that is the one thing a manipulator cannot function without. Without your emotional reactions, their tactics starved. The guilt trips didn't hit, the provocations didn't shake you, the mind games didn't move you. And when someone who depends on emotional access can no longer reach your feelings, they feel powerless, irrelevant, and exposed. Because deep down their control was never about strength, it was about your old vulnerability. You're not the same person they once manipulated. Your growth closed every door they used to walk through. Your emotional stability ruined the script they depended on. And now they're upset, not because you changed, but because your change took back the authority they were never entitled to in the first place. Number 10. You forced them to confront the truth. Their intelligence was just a well-decorated illusion. People who rely on manipulation instead of integrity always believe they're smarter than everyone else. It's not because they are intelligent. It's because their entire identity depends on winning through distortion, deception, and psychological shortcuts. They mistake trickery for brilliance. They confuse secrecy with strategy. They think reading your wounds is the same as reading your mind. But the moment you woke up, the spell broke. You didn't just outgrow their tactics. You saw the architecture of the game itself. And once a chosen one sees the blueprint, the whole illusion collapses. You forced them to face a reality they never prepared for. They weren't masterminds. They were survivalists. They weren't strategic. They were opportunistic. They weren't superior. They were hiding behind smoke and mirrors. Your clarity became a mirror they couldn't escape, and for the first time, they had to see themselves without the advantage of your confusion. You realized something they hoped you'd never figure out. Their power didn't come from intelligence, it came from your innocence. It came from your trust. It came from your inability to imagine that someone could operate that low. Now that your eyes are open, their entire persona falls apart. You stripped away the theatrics, and what's left is painfully underwhelming. Someone whose genius was nothing more than manipulation performed in the dark, hoping you'd never turn on the light. And you did. That's why they fear you now. Not because you're cruel, not because you're vengeful, but because you finally see them at their actual size. And once a chosen one sees truth, nothing and no one can hide behind illusion again. Number 11. They're ashamed because you exposed the one truth. They never wanted you to see. Their power only worked if you pretended not to notice. Manipulators aren't strong. They're strategic about hiding their weakness. Everything they do depends on a single fragile condition: you not seeing what they're doing. The entire ecosystem of their control was built on the assumption that you would keep. You were never the prey. You were the permission. And the moment you stopped giving that permission, their whole structure collapsed. They're not ashamed because you caught them. They're ashamed because your awareness proved how powerless they actually were without your innocence supporting the illusion. You weren't just a target, you were the scaffolding holding up their fake superiority. And once you saw clearly, they realized something they've always feared. They needed your confusion more than you ever needed their presence. Your awakening didn't just expose their behavior, it exposed their dependency. It revealed that all their arrogance, all their confidence, all their "I'm smarter than you" energy was nothing but a performance that collapses the moment the audience opens their eyes. That's why the shame burns them so deeply. You didn't just see who they were, you saw how much they required you to stay blind. And once a chosen one wakes up, there is no going back. Not for you, and not for them. Because now they have to live with a truth they can't unsee. They were never powerful. You were just patient. Number 12. They realize, now that you read them in real time, not in hindsight. What unsettles them isn't just that you figured them out, it's the timing. Most people only understand manipulation after the chaos has already unfolded. They look back, replay conversations, and slowly piece together the signs. But you didn't need a replay. You were catching everything while it was happening. Every tone shift, every inconsistency, every emotional bait, every calculated pause. You were decoding it in real time. That's what shook them to their core. You weren't reacting, you were observing. You weren't confused, you were connecting dots. And the more they tried to adjust their tactics, the faster you understood what they were doing. They weren't dealing with someone who needed closure or explanation. They were dealing with someone whose intuition worked like a live radar. They realized you were listening on two levels, the surface words and the hidden intention beneath them. You weren't distracted by the performance. You were watching the motives behind the performance, and every time they thought they delivered a convincing script, you were already ahead of them, stripping the lie down to its structure. This is where the fear comes in. Manipulators need delays. They rely on confusion, reflection, and emotional vulnerability to give them time to build their next move. But you gave them nothing to work with. No delay, no hesitation, no emotional fog for them to hide in. You read them at the speed they tried to deceive you. And once someone sees you have this level of instant discernment, the dynamic changes. They cannot outthink you. They cannot outrun your awareness. They cannot reinvent themselves fast enough to escape your understanding. Your real power wasn't in walking away. It was in recognizing them before they finished crafting the illusion. And that's what makes you dangerous to anyone who thrives on deception. You don't need hindsight. You see the truth the moment it enters the room. Number 13. You turned their mental maze into a straight line, and that destroyed the advantage they thought they had. Manipulators rely on complexity the same way magicians rely on distraction. The more twists, turns, contradictions, emotional triggers, and mixed signals they create, the harder it becomes for their target to see what's actually happening. Their power works like a maze, not because the maze is intelligent, but because it's disorienting. The goal is to keep you walking in circles until you feel too exhausted to question the structure itself. But you didn't walk their maze. You mapped it. You picked up on patterns they assumed you'd miss. You recognized the recycled tactics, the repeated emotional triggers, the predictable cycles of guilt and affection. You saw the routine underneath the chaos, and once you understood the routine, the confusion evaporated. What they thought would overwhelm you ended up exposing how shallow their complexity really was. That's where the collapse began. The moment you turned their maze into a straight line, a simple cause-effect-motive equation, their entire psychological advantage dissolved. They weren't dealing with someone tangled in their illusions anymore. They were dealing with someone who could trace their behavior like a child tracing a dotted line. What frightened them wasn't that you solved the puzzle. It was that you solved them. You made their strategies predictable. You made their tricks transparent. You made their manipulations boring. And manipulators cannot survive in an environment where their mind games no longer create emotional fog. Without confusion to hide behind, they have nothing left but who they truly are. And that's the part they never wanted to be seen. Your clarity became their downfall, because clarity exposes simplicity. And the one thing every manipulator fears is being revealed as simple, not powerful. You didn't just escape their maze. You showed them it was never a maze to begin with. It was a straight path they tried to disguise, and you walked right through it. Number 14. They're not just upset, they're panicking. Because you've become immune to their old identity. What unsettles manipulative people the most isn't your strength. It's the moment their identity stops working on you. Manipulators don't just use tactics. They are their tactics. Their charm, their guilt trips, their emotional pressure, their sudden coldness, their selective kindness, all of it forms a version of themselves designed to control you. And when that version stops affecting you, it's not just a failure of strategy. It feels like a personal collapse. Your growth didn't just elevate you, it rewired you. You began processing everything differently. What once stirred your anxiety now activates your discernment. What once made you second-guess yourself now makes you analyze their motive. What once hooked you emotionally now leaves you completely unbothered. You're not numb, you're informed. You're not hardened, you're awakened. And once awareness settles in, manipulation loses its grip instantly. That's what triggered their panic. Their identity depends on emotional access. They need you to doubt yourself. They need you to crave their approval. They need you to react, to defend yourself, to explain yourself, to be thrown off balance. But you no longer respond like you used to. You've outgrown the emotional version of yourself they were targeting, and they're still fighting a war with a person who no longer exists. Your spiritual insight became the firewall they can't bypass. You feel the energy behind their words before they finish speaking. You sense the pressure behind their compliments, the hidden intent behind their concerns, the manipulation woven into their tone. And because your spirit processes truth faster than your mind used to process confusion, their entire identity has become ineffective. Your immunity terrifies them because their influence wasn't built on real power. It was built on your old vulnerability. And now that vulnerability has evolved into strength, clarity, and internal peace, they have no door left to enter, no button left to push, no narrative left to twist. You didn't just escape their control. You transformed into someone their old identity can't reach, can't manipulate, and can't intimidate. Conclusion. Everything you've just heard points to one undeniable truth. You didn't just outgrow their manipulation. You dismantled it from the inside out. You became the one thing every deceiver fears. Someone who sees clearly, moves wisely, and no longer falls for the same emotional illusions they built their identity on. You didn't win because you fought harder. You won because you evolved faster. You shifted in ways they couldn't predict, matured in ways they couldn't block, and awakened in ways they couldn't outrun. You cracked their patterns, disrupted their cycles, and outpaced the very mindset they thought would keep you stuck. They relied on confusion. You chose clarity. They relied on your old wounds. You strengthened your spirit. They relied on access. You closed every door they used to sneak through. And the moment you stepped into this higher awareness, their influence didn't just weaken, it collapsed completely. Every tactic they used became outdated. Every mind game they tried became transparent. Every identity they performed lost its effect. You rose into a version of yourself that no longer matches the person they planned to manipulate. And that transformation was the final blow, Not because it was loud or dramatic, but because it was irreversible. Your discernment became your armor. Your peace became your shield. Your growth became their exposure. And now they're scrambling, not because you hurt them, but because you healed in a way they can no longer exploit. You've reclaimed your power, your clarity, your inner stability, and when a chosen one reaches that level, nothing and no one can drag them back into old psychological traps. So carry this truth with confidence. You didn't just catch their mind games. You outgrew the version of you that ever entertained them, and that is a victory they cannot undo. If this message spoke to your spirit, make sure you subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, drop a comment, and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Your support helps this message reach more chosen ones stepping into their power. Keep rising. Your clarity is your crown. God bless you.